I'm going to share the devastating yet ultimately triumphant story of Robert, a 52-year-old man from Phoenix, Arizona, who lost everything: his multi-million-dollar fortune, his beautiful home, his luxury cars, his family, his marriage, all to sports betting addiction. But who found the strength to crawl out of the deepest pit of despair and transform his greatest failure into his life's greatest purpose? Hello, my dear friends. It's always such a joy to be here with you, sharing these stories that remind us of the incredible resilience of the human spirit. You know, after all these years of living and listening to so many stories, I've learned that sometimes our greatest victories come disguised as our most devastating defeats. And Robert's story, oh my goodness, it's going to show you just how true that really is. Now, before we dive into this incredible journey, I want you to do me a little favor. If this story touches your heart, and I promise you it will, please hit that like button for me. And if you haven't subscribed yet, please do subscribe and ring that notification bell, because every week I share stories like this one that can truly change your perspective on life. And please, please don't leave this video early, because the ending of Robert's story is so powerful, so moving, that it will give you chills and restore your faith in second chances. But before we begin today's story, I always like to share something special with you that might help. I've left some wonderful natural products in the description that have been such a blessing in my life and might help you too. These are products I personally use and recommend for various health concerns like sleep, joint comfort, energy, and overall wellness. Just click the link in the description to learn more and support our channel family. Now let me tell you about Robert Martinez. Picture this: a man in his early 40s, standing 6 feet tall with kind brown eyes and calloused hands that spoke of years of honest work. Robert owned Martinez Construction, a thriving business he'd built from the ground up in Phoenix, Arizona. He had everything the American dream promised: a beautiful 2-story home in an upscale neighborhood with a swimming pool where his 2 teenage children, Sophia and Miguel, would spend their summer afternoons. He had a loving wife, Carmen, who had stood by his side for 18 years, through the lean early days when they could barely afford groceries, all the way to the abundant years when they could finally breathe easy about money. Robert's garage housed not 1 but 3 vehicles: his practical work truck, Carmen's reliable sedan, and his pride and joy, a sleek black BMW that he'd bought himself for his 40th birthday. It wasn't just a car to Robert. It was proof that the scared young man who had immigrated from Mexico with nothing but hope in his heart had made it in America. But you know what, dear friends? Sometimes the very things we think make us successful can become the foundation of our downfall. And for Robert, that foundation began to crack with something that seemed so innocent, so harmless. Watching football games on Sunday afternoons. Picture Robert in his comfortable leather recliner, a cold beer in his hand, watching his beloved Arizona Cardinals play. Carmen would be in the kitchen, preparing their traditional Sunday dinner, the aroma of her famous enchiladas filling the house. Sophia and Miguel would be sprawled on the carpet, doing homework or playing video games. It was the picture of American family bliss. But then came that fateful Sunday in October 2019. Robert's brother-in-law, Danny, was visiting for the game. During halftime, Danny casually mentioned that he'd placed a small bet on the Cardinals to win. "Just $20, Danny laughed, waving his phone. "Makes the game more exciting, you know." Robert had never gambled before. Oh, he'd bought the occasional lottery ticket. Maybe dropped a few dollars in a casino slot machine during their anniversary trip to Vegas. But nothing serious. But something about Danny's excitement The way his eyes lit up when he talked about the action sparked something in Robert that he didn't even recognize at the time. "How do you do it?" Robert asked. And those 5 words, my dear friends, would eventually cost him everything he held dear. Danny showed him the app on his phone. DraftKings, FanDuel, BetMGM. Names that would soon become as familiar to Robert as his own children's names. "It's so easy," Danny explained, swiping through the interface. "You just pick the team, decide how much you want to bet, and if you're right, you win money. If you're wrong, well, you only lose what you put in." The Cardinals won that day, 28-21. Danny collected his winnings, $40 for his $20 bet. Robert watched his brother-in-law's celebration, the high fives, the victory dance around the living room, and something stirred deep in his chest. It wasn't about the money, not really. Robert's construction business was doing well. $20 or $40 meant nothing to him. It was about the thrill, the rush, the feeling of being right about something, when it mattered. That night, after Carmen and the kids had gone to bed, Robert sat in his home office, ostensibly reviewing construction contracts. But instead, he found himself downloading the DraftKings app onto his phone. Just to look, he told himself. Just to understand how it worked. The next Sunday, Robert placed his first bet, $50 on the Cardinals to beat the Rams. When Arizona pulled ahead in the 4th quarter, Robert felt something he'd never experienced before. A rush of adrenaline that made his heart race and his palms sweat. It was better than the feeling he got when he landed a big construction contract. Better than the satisfaction of completing a challenging build. This was immediate, intense, intoxicating. The Cardinals won by a field goal. Robert had turned $50 into $95 in 3 hours. As he watched the numbers change in his account, he felt like he'd discovered a secret that the rest of the world didn't know about. You know, my dear friends, I've lived long enough to recognize the signs of trouble, even when they're dressed up as good fortune. When something feels too good to be true, too easy, too perfect. Well, that's usually because it is. But Robert, bless his heart, was caught up in the intoxication of that first win. He didn't see the trap that was closing around him. The following week, Robert bet $100 on Monday Night Football. When he won again, he felt like a genius. By November, he was betting on every Cardinals game, and by December, he'd expanded to college football. The amounts grew gradually, 200 here, 300 there. After all, he was winning more often than he was losing, and even when he lost, it was money he could afford to part with. Carmen noticed that Robert seemed more interested in the games than usual, more invested in the outcomes. But she attributed it to the stress of running his business. The construction industry was competitive, and she knew Robert carried the weight of providing for their family on his shoulders. If watching football helped him relax, she was all for it. But by the time the NFL playoffs arrived in January 2020, Robert's hobby had evolved into something more serious. He was studying injury reports, weather forecasts, coaching strategies. He subscribed to premium sports analysis websites and spent hours reading expert predictions. He told himself he was developing a system, a scientific approach to sports betting that would guarantee consistent profits. The dangerous thing about gambling addiction, my loves, is that it's so gradual, so sneaky. It doesn't announce itself with sirens and warning bells. It whispers sweet promises in your ear, convincing you that you're smarter than everyone else, that you've found the secret to easy money. And every win validates that belief, while every loss is just a temporary setback, a fluke that won't happen again if you just bet a little smarter next time. Robert's first real warning sign came during the Super Bowl. He'd been riding a hot streak through the playoffs, turning what started as $100 bets into $1,000 wagers. His account balance had grown to over $8,000 in winnings. Money that felt like pure profit, since he'd started with just $50 of his own. For the Super Bowl, Robert decided to bet big, really big. He put $5,000 on the Kansas City Chiefs to win. It was money he'd won from previous bets, he reasoned. So it wasn't really his money anyway. When the Chiefs fell behind early and never recovered, Robert watched $5,000 disappear in 4 hours. The loss stung, but what scared Robert more was how quickly he rationalized it away. $5,000 was nothing compared to what he'd make next season, he told himself. He'd learned valuable lessons from this loss. He wouldn't make the same mistakes again. But here's what Robert didn't understand yet, dear friends. Gambling addiction isn't about winning or losing money. It's about chasing a feeling, a chemical rush that floods your brain with dopamine and makes you feel more alive than anything else in your world. And once your brain gets addicted to that feeling, once it starts craving that chemical high, money becomes just the vehicle for getting your next fix. As winter turned to spring, Robert discovered basketball betting. The NBA had games almost every night, which meant opportunities to win almost every night. He told himself he was just trying to win back what he'd lost on the Super Bowl. But the truth was, he'd fallen in love with the action itself. Carmen began to notice changes in Robert's behavior. He was constantly checking his phone, even during family dinners. He seemed distracted, distant, like part of his mind was always somewhere else. When she asked about it, Robert would brush off her concerns, saying he was just keeping up with industry news or checking on work projects. The lies started small, my dear friends. Little white lies that seemed harmless enough. When Carmen asked why he was spending so much time on his phone, Robert would say he was researching new construction techniques or communicating with suppliers. When she wondered why he seemed so interested in basketball games between teams they'd never cared about before, he'd say he was just trying to stay informed about sports to connect better with his clients. But lies, even small ones, have a way of growing. They multiply and mutate, creating a web of deception that becomes harder and harder to maintain. And every lie Robert told to protect his secret made the secret itself feel more shameful, more dangerous, more impossible to confess. By the summer of 2020, Robert was betting on baseball games, tennis matches, soccer leagues, in countries he couldn't pronounce. The COVID-19 pandemic had actually made his gambling worse, not better. With many sports suspended or playing to empty stadiums, the betting lines were more unpredictable, which Robert convinced himself created more opportunities for someone smart enough to exploit them. But the truth was, Robert wasn't winning anymore. The hot streak that had started everything was long over, replaced by a grinding series of losses that he kept trying to chase with bigger and bigger bets. He'd heard about something called the double down strategy. When you lose a bet, you double your next bet so that when you eventually win, you'll recover all your losses plus a profit. It sounds logical, doesn't it? But what Robert didn't realize was that this strategy, which gamblers call the martingale system, requires unlimited funds and unlimited betting limits. In the real world, it's a guaranteed path to bankruptcy. Robert's first double-down bet was $1,000 on a baseball game. When he lost, he bet $2,000 on the next game. When he lost again, he bet $4,000. By the time he finally won a bet, he'd lost $7,000 to win back $1,000. But in his mind, he'd broken even, and that felt like a victory. Oh, my dear friends, if only Robert could have seen what we can see now, that he was already tumbling down a cliff, desperately grabbing at branches that kept breaking in his hands. But addiction is a master of disguise. It convinces its victims that they're in control, even as it systematically destroys their lives. Carmen started noticing financial irregularities that fall. Credit card bills that seemed higher than usual. bank statements that Robert seemed reluctant to discuss. When she asked about their savings account balance, Robert would deflect, saying business was seasonal and things would pick up soon. The truth was, Robert had already started dipping into their emergency fund. Just small amounts at first, $500 here, $1,000 there. Money he promised himself he'd pay back as soon as he hit his next winning streak. But the winning streaks became fewer and farther between, while the losing streak seemed to stretch on forever. Robert's construction business began to suffer as his attention became more and more consumed by gambling. He'd be on job sites checking betting lines instead of supervising work. He'd miss important client meetings because they conflicted with games he'd bet on. His reputation for reliability and attention to detail, the foundation of his business success, started to crack. But nothing could have prepared Robert for what happened in March 2021. He'd been on a particularly brutal losing streak, down nearly $15,000 over 2 weeks. In his desperation to recover, he made the decision that would change everything. He took out a second mortgage on their house. Now, let me pause here for a moment, my loves, because I want you to understand something important. Robert wasn't a bad man. He wasn't evil or malicious or even particularly reckless by nature. He was a good father, a loving husband, a man who had built a successful business through hard work and integrity. But addiction has a way of hijacking our moral compass, of convincing us that desperate situations justify desperate measures. Robert told himself that the second mortgage was a business investment. He'd use the $50,000 to make strategic bets, win back everything he'd lost, pay off the mortgage, and never gamble again. It was a perfect plan, except for one small problem. It was based on the delusion that he could control outcomes that were fundamentally random. The $50,000 lasted 6 weeks. Don't leave me now, dear friends, because what Robert discovered next is going to break your heart. But it's also the beginning of the most important part of his journey. When Carmen discovered the second mortgage during a routine review of their homeowner's insurance, Robert's carefully constructed house of lies finally collapsed. I can only imagine the look on that poor woman's face when she realized that their home, the symbol of everything they'd built together, was now at risk because of debts she knew nothing about. The confrontation that followed was devastating. Carmen demanded to know where the money had gone, and for the first time in almost 2 years, Robert told the complete truth. He confessed to the betting, the losses, the lies, the desperate attempts to win everything back. He showed her his betting accounts, the credit card statements, the loan documents. Carmen's reaction was swift and decisive. She took the children and moved in with her sister. She changed the passwords on all their joint accounts. She consulted with a divorce attorney. In the span of 1 week, Robert went from having a family to having nothing but an empty house and a gambling problem that had cost him everything he'd ever cared about. But you know what? Sometimes losing everything is exactly what we need to find ourselves. Because when you've lost everything external, your money, your family, your home, your reputation, you're finally forced to look inward. And that's where Robert's real journey was about to begin. The divorce proceedings were finalized by Christmas 2021. Carmen got the house, primary custody of the children, and most of their remaining assets. Robert moved into a small 1-bedroom apartment in a part of Phoenix he'd only driven through before, working construction jobs for other companies instead of running his own. But the worst part wasn't the financial devastation, or even losing his family. The worst part was that Robert kept gambling. Even after losing everything, even after destroying the lives of the people he loved most, Robert couldn't stop. The addiction had such a powerful grip on his brain that he'd take his meager paycheck from his construction job and immediately head to the closest casino or place bets on his phone. He was like a man trying to put out a fire with gasoline, but he couldn't see any other way to solve his problems except to win big enough to undo all the damage he'd caused. This is the part of addiction that's hardest for people to understand, my dear friends. From the outside, it seems impossible that someone would continue a behavior that's clearly destroying their life. But addiction rewires the brain, creating neural pathways that make the addictive behavior feel not just desirable, but necessary for survival. Robert spent the next year and a half in what he now calls the darkness. He was barely functioning, going through the motions of work and sleep, while every spare moment and dollar was consumed by gambling. He lost job after job because he couldn't focus, couldn't be trusted with company money, couldn't show up consistently. He moved from the one-bedroom apartment to a studio apartment, to finally a room in a boarding house where the only other residents were other men who had lost everything to various addictions. His children, Sophia and Miguel, wanted nothing to do with him. His calls went unanswered, his texts ignored. Carmen had built a new life without him, and frankly, he couldn't blame her. There were nights when Robert sat in his tiny room, surrounded by empty takeout containers and unpaid bills, seriously contemplating suicide. He'd destroyed everything good in his life, hurt everyone he'd ever loved, and seemed incapable of stopping the behavior that had caused all this destruction. What was the point of continuing to exist? But sometimes, my loves, when we think we've reached the absolute bottom, when we think there's nowhere left to fall, life has a way of showing us that rock bottom can actually be a foundation. And for Robert, that foundation started with 5 words spoken by a stranger in the most unlikely place. Robert was at a gas station at 2 a.m, having just lost his last $20 on a mobile betting app while sitting in his beat-up old pickup truck. He was crying, actually sobbing, when an older gentleman knocked on his passenger window. Robert rolled it down, expecting to be asked for directions or spare change. Instead, the man said simply, "You don't have to live like this." Now wait right here, because what that stranger said next changed everything for Robert, and I guarantee it's going to give you chills too. The man's name was Frank, and he was 73 years old with silver hair and eyes that seemed to hold a lifetime of understanding. He told Robert that he'd been watching him for 10 minutes, saw him on his phone, saw the despair that followed, and recognized the signs immediately. 30 years ago, Frank said, leaning against Robert's truck, I was sitting in a car just like this one, in a parking lot just like this one, having lost everything I owned to poker games and horse races. I was planning to drive this car straight into a bridge abutment. Robert stared at this stranger who seemed to be reading his mind. "What stopped you?" he whispered. "Another man, just like me, who told me the same thing I'm telling you now. You don't have to live like this. There's a way out, but you can't do it alone." Frank reached into his wallet and pulled out a small white card. "Gamblers Anonymous," he said. "Tomorrow night, 7 o'clock, St. Matthew's Church on Camelback Road. You don't have to say anything. You don't have to do anything except show up." Robert took the card with trembling hands. "Does it work?" he asked. Frank smiled, and Robert could see peace in his eyes, something Robert hadn't felt in over 3 years. "I haven't placed a bet in 30 years, Frank said. "I got my family back, built a new business, found purpose again. But more importantly, I learned how to live with myself." As Frank walked away, Robert sat in his truck holding that little white card like it was a lifeline. And maybe, just maybe, it was. The next evening, Robert found himself sitting in the basement of St. Matthew's Church, surrounded by 15 other people who looked just as broken as he felt. There was a teacher who'd lost her pension to online poker, a retired firefighter who'd gambled away his disability payments, a young mother who'd stolen from her children's college funds to feed her sports betting addiction. For the first time in years, Robert didn't feel alone. The meeting format was simple. People shared their stories without judgment, talked about their struggles, celebrated small victories, and supported each other through the daily battle of choosing not to gamble. Robert didn't speak that first night, or the second, or even the third. He just listened to these people who understood exactly what he was going through. On his fourth meeting, a woman named Patricia shared her story. She'd lost her home, her marriage, and custody of her teenage daughter to slot machine addiction. But she'd been clean for 6 months and had just received her first text message from her daughter in 2 years. "Recovery isn't about getting back what you lost," Patricia said, tears streaming down her face. "It's about becoming someone worthy of whatever comes next." Those words hit Robert like lightning. He'd been so focused on trying to win back his old life that he'd never considered the possibility of building a new one. That night, for the first time in months, Robert went to sleep without placing a bet. The early days of recovery were brutal, my dear friends. Robert's brain had been so accustomed to the constant stimulation of gambling that normal life felt incredibly boring. He'd wake up with withdrawal symptoms, sweating, anxiety, an almost physical craving to place a bet. There were days when he'd drive to the casino parking lot and sit there for hours, fighting with himself. But Frank became his sponsor, checking in daily, available for phone calls at any hour. One day at a time, Frank would remind him, "You don't have to stay clean forever. You just have to stay clean today." Robert also started attending therapy, working with a counselor who specialized in addiction. Dr. Sarah Martinez, no relation, just a fortunate coincidence in names, helped him understand that his gambling wasn't about money or sports. It was about escaping feelings of inadequacy, of not being enough, of needing external validation to feel worthy. When you were winning, Dr. Martinez explained, you felt powerful, intelligent, successful. When you were losing, you felt like a failure who needed to win to prove his worth again. The gambling wasn't the disease. It was the symptom. The disease was believing that your value as a person depended on external achievements. This revelation was both devastating and liberating. Devastating because it meant Robert had to confront deep-seated feelings of unworthiness that had nothing to do with gambling. Liberating because it meant recovery was about more than just not betting. It was about fundamentally changing how he saw himself. Robert threw himself into recovery with the same intensity he'd once brought to gambling. He attended GA meetings 5 times a week, worked the 12 steps with Frank's guidance, and began the difficult process of making amends to the people he'd hurt. The conversation with Carmen was the hardest thing he'd ever done. She agreed to meet him at a coffee shop after 6 months of sobriety, and Robert could see the wariness in her eyes, the protective wall she'd built around herself and their children. "I'm not here to ask for forgiveness," Robert told her. "I'm here to acknowledge the pain I caused, and to let you know that I'm getting help. I understand if you never want to see me again, but I need you to know that I take full responsibility for destroying our family." Carmen listened without saying much, her face a mask of controlled emotion. When Robert finished, she was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "The man I married would never have done what you did. I need to know, is that man gone forever? Or is there a chance he might come back?" Robert considered her question carefully. "The man you married was never as strong as you thought he was," he said finally. "But I'm working on becoming someone stronger. Someone who deserves a second chance, even if he never gets one." It wasn't reconciliation, but it wasn't a final goodbye either. Carmen agreed to let Robert send letters to Sophia and Miguel, though she would read them first. It was a small opening, but for Robert it felt like hope. "You know, my dear friends, there's something beautiful about hitting rock bottom. Not the hitting part. That's terrible. But what happens next? When you've lost everything you thought defined you, you have the opportunity to discover who you really are underneath all those external trappings." And what Robert discovered was that he had a gift for helping people. At his GA meetings, newcomers were naturally drawn to Robert. Maybe it was because his story was so extreme. He'd lost literally everything. Or maybe it was because he talked about recovery with such honesty and hope. People sought him out after meetings. called him during difficult moments, asked for his advice on handling specific challenges. Frank noticed this gift too. "You've got something special, Robert," he said one evening, after a particularly powerful meeting where Robert had helped talk a newcomer out of leaving early. "Have you ever thought about becoming a counselor?" The idea had never occurred to Robert. His formal education ended with high school, and his entire career had been in construction. But Dr. Martinez encouraged him to explore the possibility. "Some of the best addiction counselors are people who have walked the path themselves," she said. "You understand the disease from the inside out." Robert started researching addiction counseling programs while continuing his work in construction. The pay was terrible. He was basically starting over at age 49. But for the first time in years, he felt like he had a purpose beyond just surviving each day. After 18 months of sobriety, Robert enrolled in a community college program for addiction counseling. He studied in the evenings after work, often falling asleep over textbooks in his tiny apartment. But every difficult test, every challenging assignment, felt like he was building something meaningful instead of just tearing things down. The most remarkable thing happened during his practicum at a local treatment center. Robert was assigned to facilitate a group therapy session for people with gambling addictions, and as he sat in that circle, looking at faces that reflected his own past desperation, he realized that his worst experiences had become his greatest qualifications. "I know exactly what you're going through," he told the group, "because I've been exactly where you are. I lost a multi-million-dollar business, a beautiful home, a wonderful family, and the respect of everyone I cared about. I lived in places you wouldn't keep your dog, with people who had given up on life completely. I know what it feels like to want to die, rather than face another day of the consequences of your choices." The room was absolutely silent. Then Robert continued, "But I also know that you can come back from this. Not to your old life, that's probably gone forever, but to something new, something better, something that actually has meaning and purpose. The question isn't whether you can recover. The question is whether you're willing to do the work." A young man named Tyler, who reminded Robert painfully of his own son Miguel, raised his hand. "How do I know I won't just mess up again? How do I know this time will be different?" Robert smiled. "You don't know. None of us know. But here's what I learned. Recovery isn't about guarantees. It's about choosing, one day at a time, to be the person you want to be, instead of the person your addiction tells you to be. And every day you make that choice, you get a little bit stronger." After the session, Tyler approached Robert privately. "I've been in 3 different programs," he said, "but this is the first time someone made me believe I could actually do this." That conversation changed everything for Robert. He realized that his painful journey hadn't just been about his own recovery. It had been preparation for helping others find their way out of the same darkness. But here's where the story gets really incredible, my dear friends, because what Robert did next shows the true power of turning your greatest weakness into your greatest strength. Robert graduated from the addiction counseling program with honors and immediately started working at the treatment center where he'd done his practicum. But working within someone else's system, while rewarding, felt limiting. Robert had ideas about how to reach people who weren't ready for traditional treatment, people who were still in the early stages of gambling addiction before they'd lost everything. He started small, organizing informal support groups in community centers and churches. He created flyers and left them in places where problem gamblers might see them: sports bars, gas stations near casinos, even taped to ATM machines outside betting parlors. The message was simple. Lost money gambling? You're not alone. Free support group. No judgment. Just people who understand. The groups grew slowly but steadily. Robert's approach was different from traditional GA meetings. He focused less on the spiritual aspects of the 12 steps and more on practical strategies for rebuilding life after gambling addiction. He brought in guest speakers, financial advisors who helped people manage debt, career counselors who helped people find new jobs, family therapists who specialized in addiction recovery. But Robert's real innovation was his focus on prevention. He started visiting high schools and colleges, talking to young people about the dangers of sports betting, especially as it became more normalized and accessible through mobile apps. "I tell them about the first bet I ever placed," Robert explained to Dr. Martinez during one of their sessions. "How innocent it seemed. How excited I felt when I won. I want them to understand that addiction doesn't start with someone deciding to ruin their life. It starts with someone thinking they've found an easy way to make money and have fun." These prevention talks led to Robert being invited to speak at community events, business conferences, and even legislative hearings about gambling regulation. His story was so compelling, his transformation so complete, that people listened when he talked about the real costs of gambling addiction. It was during one of these speaking engagements that Robert met Dr. Jennifer Walsh, a researcher at Arizona State University, who was studying gambling addiction prevention. Dr. Walsh had been looking for someone to help her design a community outreach program, and Robert's combination of lived experience and formal training made him the perfect collaborator. Together they wrote a grant proposal for something unprecedented, a comprehensive gambling addiction prevention and treatment program that would combine education, early intervention, and long-term recovery support. The program would be called Second Chance Recovery, and it would serve as a model for communities across the country. When they received word that their grant had been approved for $1.2 million over 3 years, Robert sat in his little apartment and cried, not from grief this time, but from gratitude. The same disease that had destroyed his life was now going to help him save other people's lives. Don't go anywhere, my loves, because what happens next in Robert's story will restore your faith in the power of redemption and second chances. The first thing Robert did with the grant money was hire Tyler, the young man from his therapy group who had asked about guarantees. Tyler had been clean for 2 years and had just finished his own addiction counseling certification. Robert also hired Patricia, the woman whose story about becoming worthy of whatever comes next had inspired his own recovery. Second Chance Recovery opened its doors in January 2024 in a modest building in central Phoenix. But it wasn't like any addiction treatment center anyone had seen before. Robert had designed it to feel more like a community center than a medical facility. There were comfortable meeting rooms, a kitchen where people could share meals, even a small gym where people could work out their anxiety and stress. The program had 3 components. The first was prevention education, teams that went out into the community to teach people about the warning signs of gambling addiction. The second was early intervention, support groups and counseling for people who were beginning to have problems but hadn't yet lost everything. The third was comprehensive recovery support, everything from financial counseling to job training to family therapy. But Robert's master stroke was the peer support component. Every staff member at Second Chance Recovery was either a person in recovery from gambling addiction or someone whose family had been affected by a loved one's gambling. This wasn't just a job for these people. It was a mission. The results were remarkable. In their first year, Second Chance Recovery helped over 200 people either prevent gambling problems from developing or begin their recovery journey. More importantly, they had a 78% success rate for people who completed their 6-month program, far higher than the national average for gambling addiction treatment. Media attention followed. Robert found himself being interviewed on local television, featured in newspaper articles, even invited to speak at national conferences on addiction treatment. But the moment that meant the most to him came on a Tuesday evening in March 2024. Robert was facilitating his weekly support group when someone knocked on the conference room door. Tyler got up to answer it, and Robert heard him say, "I'm sorry, we're in the middle of a meeting. Can I help you with something?" Then Robert heard a voice he hadn't heard in person for over 3 years. "I'm looking for Robert Martinez. I'm his son." Miguel walked into that room, now 21 years old, and looking so much like Robert that several group members did double takes. He was tall and lean, with the same kind eyes Robert remembered, but there was a wariness there too, a protective distance that broke Robert's heart. "Could we have a few minutes?" Miguel asked the group. Robert nodded to Tyler, who skillfully transitioned into leading the discussion himself. Father and son walked out to the lobby, and for a moment, they just looked at each other. Miguel had grown from a teenager into a young man during their separation, and Robert felt the weight of all the missed moments. Birthdays, graduations, everyday conversations that would never happen. "Mom told me about this place," Miguel said finally. "About what you're doing here. She said you've been clean for 3 years." 3 years, 2 months, and 16 days, Robert replied. "But who's counting?" Miguel almost smiled at that. "She also said you've been writing to us. To Sophia and me." Robert nodded. "I know you haven't been ready to read them. I understand." "I read them," Miguel said quietly. "Sophia did too. We needed time to figure out if we could trust you again." The conversation that followed was one of the most difficult and beautiful of Robert's life. Miguel talked about the anger he'd carried, the shame of having to explain to friends why his father had lost their house, the fear that he might have inherited some genetic predisposition to addiction. Robert listened without defending himself, without making excuses, without trying to minimize the pain he'd caused. When Miguel finished, Robert said simply, "I'm sorry. I'm sorry for everything I put you and Sophia and your mother through. I'm sorry for missing so much of your life, and I'm sorry that my recovery can't undo the damage I caused." Miguel was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "The father I remember wouldn't have built a place like this. He was a good man, but he was selfish, I guess. Everything was about him and his success and his image. This place, what you're doing here, it's about other people. I had to lose everything to learn what really mattered," Robert said. "I just wish I could have learned it without hurting all of you in the process." Miguel nodded. "Sophia wants to meet with you too. And Mom says she's proud of what you've built here. She's not ready to be friends, but she's not angry anymore either. It wasn't a full reconciliation, but it was a beginning. And sometimes, my dear friends, a beginning is all we need to start believing in the possibility of redemption." Over the following months, Robert slowly rebuilt relationships with his children. Sophia, now 19, and studying psychology at Arizona State University, was particularly interested in her father's work. She started volunteering at Second Chance Recovery, helping with administrative tasks and learning about addiction treatment. "I want to understand what happened to our family," she told Robert one day. "Not to forgive you necessarily, but to make sense of it, and maybe to help other families going through the same thing." Robert's relationship with Carmen remained complex. They could have civil conversations about the children, even share proud moments about Sophia's academic achievements or Miguel's promotion at his job. But there was still too much hurt, too much broken trust for anything deeper to develop. And Robert had learned to accept that some consequences of his actions might be permanent. But he'd also learned that redemption doesn't require getting back everything you lost. Sometimes redemption means accepting the consequences of your choices while working to ensure that others don't have to face the same consequences. By the spring of 2024, Second Chance Recovery had expanded to serve 3 counties in Arizona. They were getting calls from organizations in other states wanting to replicate their model. Robert found himself traveling around the country, consulting with treatment centers and community organizations about implementing comprehensive gambling addiction programs. The kid who had asked, "How do you do it?" about sports betting had become the man other people asked for help in fighting that same addiction. The person who had once destroyed at everything he touched was now building something that would help people for generations to come. And that, my dear friends, brings us to the most beautiful part of Robert's story. In June 2024, Robert received a phone call that would change everything once again. It was from the National Council on Problem Gambling, informing him that Second Chance Recovery had been selected to receive a federal grant worth $5.8 million to expand their program nationwide. Mr. Martinez, the program director said, your model has shown the most promising results we've seen in gambling addiction treatment and prevention. We want to help you take this to communities across America. Robert sat in his office, a real office, with windows and a view of the mountains he'd grown up seeing, and marveled at the journey that had brought him to this moment. 5 years earlier, he'd been living in a boarding house, spending his last dollars on desperate bets. Now he was being entrusted with nearly $6 million to help save other people from the hell he had lived through. But the real validation came from an unexpected source. 3 weeks after receiving news of the federal grant, Robert got a call from Carmen. She asked if they could meet for coffee, the first time she'd initiated contact since their divorce. They met at the same coffee shop where Robert had apologized to her 3 years earlier, but everything felt different now. Carmen looked relaxed, even happy. She'd started her own business, a catering company that was doing well. She'd also been dating someone, a kind man named David, who was good to her and respectful of her complicated relationship with Robert. I have something to tell you, Carmen said after they'd ordered their drinks. Miguel and Sophia have been asking about the possibility of you walking Sophia at her graduation next month. She's graduating summa cum laude, you know. Robert's eyes filled with tears. He hadn't been there for any of Sophia's milestones. Her quinceañera, her prom, her high school graduation. The possibility of being present for this achievement felt almost too good to be true. What do you think? Robert asked carefully. Carmen smiled, the first genuine smile she'd given him since before his gambling had destroyed everything. I think the man who built Second Chance Recovery has earned the right to celebrate his daughter's success. The graduation ceremony was small, but perfect. Robert walked Sophia across the stage, his heart bursting with pride and gratitude. Afterwards, at the family celebration, Miguel stood up to make a toast. 5 years ago, Miguel said, looking at his father, I thought I'd lost my dad forever. I was wrong. I didn't lose him. He lost himself. But the man sitting here today isn't the same person who hurt our family. He's someone who took the worst thing that ever happened to us and turned it into something that helps other families stay together. Robert had to step outside for a moment to compose himself. Tyler found him there, leaning against the building with tears streaming down his face. You okay, boss? Tyler asked. Robert laughed through his tears. You know what's crazy? I'm happier now than I ever was when I had millions of dollars. I have less money, fewer possessions, a smaller house, but I have something I never had before. What's that? I have peace. I know who I am. I know what I'm supposed to do with my life, and I know that even my worst mistakes can become something meaningful if I'm willing to do the work. By the end of 2024, Second Chance Recovery had opened satellite offices in 12 states. Robert had hired over 40 staff members, most of them people in recovery from gambling addiction. They were helping over 1,500 people at any given time, with success rates that continued to exceed national averages. But Robert's proudest achievement wasn't measured in statistics. It was measured in stories, like Sarah, the teacher who'd been embezzling from her school to fund her online poker habit, who was now 3 years clean and teaching financial literacy to other people in recovery. Or James, the retired veteran who'd lost his disability payments to sports betting, who now ran Second Chance Recovery's outreach program to other veterans. Each success story felt personal to Robert because he saw himself in every person who walked through their doors. He understood the shame, the desperation, the feeling that recovery was impossible. And because he understood it so completely, he could offer something that textbooks and training couldn't provide: genuine hope based on lived experience. The program also began attracting attention from researchers and policymakers. Dr. Walsh, Robert's original collaborator, had published several papers about their model's effectiveness. Robert found himself testifying before state legislatures about the need for better gambling addiction resources and speaking at conferences alongside some of the country's leading addiction specialists. What makes second chance recovery different? Dr. Walsh explained during one particularly important presentation to the American Psychiatric Association, isn't just that it was founded by someone in recovery. It's that every aspect of the program is designed around real understanding of what people with gambling addiction actually need, not what we think they need. The irony wasn't lost on Robert that his greatest professional success was built on his greatest personal failure. But he'd learned that irony and redemption often walked hand in hand. In early 2025, Robert received the most meaningful recognition of his new career. The Arizona State Senate passed a resolution honoring Second Chance Recovery's contribution to the state's public health, and Robert was invited to accept the award at a special ceremony. As he stood at the podium, looking out at an audience that included his children, Carmen, dozens of people whose lives had been touched by their program, and colleagues from across the addiction treatment field, Robert thought about the journey that had brought him to this moment. 5 years ago, he began, I was living in a 12 by 12 room in a boarding house, having destroyed everything I'd ever built and everyone I'd ever loved. I was convinced that my life was over, that I was too broken to be fixed, too far gone to come back. He paused, looking directly at Sophia and Miguel in the audience. I was wrong about being too broken to be fixed, but I was right about one thing. My old life was over. And that turned out to be the best thing that could have happened to me. Robert talked about the difference between restoration and redemption. Restoration is about getting back what you lost, he explained. Redemption is about becoming someone worthy of whatever comes next. I'll never get back the 20 years I could have spent building a business with integrity instead of losing everything to gambling. But I can spend the next 20 years helping other people avoid the same devastation or find their way back if they've already fallen. The applause was long and warm, but what meant the most to Robert was seeing Tyler in the audience, now running his own satellite office in Tucson, and Patricia, who had just been promoted to program director for prevention education. The people who had once been broken alongside him were now leaders in their own right, proof that recovery wasn't just possible, but transformative. After the ceremony, Robert drove to the small apartment where he still lived. He could afford something bigger now, but he'd learned that happiness didn't come from accumulating possessions. His apartment was comfortable, clean, and filled with photos of the people whose lives had been changed through second chance recovery. As he got ready for bed that night, Robert reflected on a conversation he'd had with Frank earlier that week. Frank, now in his late 70s, had been diagnosed with early-stage dementia and was beginning to step back from his sponsor duties. I need to ask you something, Frank had said during what would be their last formal sponsor meeting. Do you ever regret it? The gambling, the losses, everything that brought you to where you are now? Robert had considered the question seriously. I regret the pain I caused other people, he'd said finally. I regret the years I lost with my children, the way I hurt Carmen, the damage I did to people who trusted me. But do I regret the journey that led me to this work, to this purpose? I can't, because if I hadn't fallen as far as I did, I couldn't help people climb as high as they have. Frank had nodded, satisfied. That's the answer of someone who's truly recovered, he'd said. When you can see your worst moments as preparation for your best work, you've found real redemption. Now, lying in his modest bed in his modest apartment, Robert thought about all the people who would walk through the doors of second chance recovery locations tomorrow. People just beginning to realize they had a problem. People in the early stages of recovery. People celebrating years of sobriety. family members learning how to trust again. Each of them would be met by staff members who understood their struggle not from textbooks, but from experience. They would be offered not just treatment, but hope. Not just recovery, but redemption. Not just the chance to stop gambling, but the opportunity to transform their greatest weakness into their greatest strength. Robert's phone buzzed with a text message from Sophia. "Dad, I'm starting my master's program in addiction counseling next fall. Think you might have room for another intern at Second Chance Recovery?" He smiled as he typed back, "I think we might be able to find a spot for someone with your qualifications." As sleep began to claim him, Robert thought about the man he'd been 5 years ago, sitting in that gas station parking lot, convinced that his life was over. That man couldn't have imagined that his darkest moment was actually the first step toward his greatest purpose. The last thing Robert remembered before falling asleep was something Dr. Martinez had told him during their early sessions. Rock bottom can become the foundation for the most beautiful life you've ever imagined. She'd been right. My dear friends, as I sit here in my comfortable chair in Sarasota, thinking about Robert's incredible journey, I'm reminded of one of life's most profound truths. Our greatest victories often rise from the ashes of our most devastating defeats. Robert Martinez lost everything: his fortune, his family, his home, his dignity, his sense of self-worth. But in losing everything, he found something he'd never had before: a purpose larger than himself, a mission that transformed not just his own life, but the lives of hundreds of other people struggling with the same demons he'd faced. You know, I've lived long enough to see many people face seemingly impossible circumstances. Some are destroyed by their challenges, but others, the truly remarkable ones, are refined by them. They discover strength they never knew they had, compassion they never knew they could feel, and purpose they never knew existed. Robert's story reminds us that it's never too late to change course, never too late to make amends, never too late to become the person we were meant to be. His gambling addiction cost him everything he thought mattered, but it led him to discover what actually mattered: service, redemption, the opportunity to prevent others from walking the same dark path he'd traveled. Today, Second Chance Recovery continues to expand across the country. Robert recently told me that they're helping over 3,000 people at any given time, with new locations opening every few months. But more importantly, they're changing how we think about gambling addiction treatment, focusing on prevention, early intervention, and long-term support, rather than just crisis management. And Robert's relationship with his family continues to heal. Sophia is indeed pursuing her master's degree in addiction counseling and plans to join Second Chance Recovery after graduation. Miguel has started volunteering with their financial literacy program, helping people in recovery learn how to manage money responsibly. Even Carmen has become a supporter of the organization, occasionally attending fundraising events and speaking about how addiction affects entire families. Robert still attends Gamblers Anonymous meetings twice a week, not because he has to anymore, but because he wants to. He sponsors 3 different people in early recovery, passing on the same gift that Frank once gave him: the promise that recovery is possible, that redemption is real, and that our worst chapters don't have to define our final story. If you or someone you love is struggling with gambling addiction, please know that help is available. Organizations like Gamblers Anonymous, the National Council on Problem Gambling, and programs like Second Chance Recovery exist because people like Robert were willing to transform their pain into purpose. Remember, my loves, that every ending can become a beginning if we're brave enough to do the work. Every failure can become the foundation for something beautiful if we're willing to learn from it rather than be destroyed by it. Before I go, I want to remind you about those wonderful natural products I mentioned earlier. You'll find links in the description to supplements that can help with anxiety, sleep issues, and overall wellness, things that can be so important when you're supporting someone through recovery, or dealing with stress in your own life. These are products I personally use and trust. Please don't forget to subscribe to our channel and ring that notification bell so you never miss these inspiring stories. Leave me a comment below telling me what you thought of Robert's incredible journey. And if you know someone who might benefit from hearing this story, please share it with them. Until next time, remember that no matter how dark your current chapter might be, it's never the end of your story. There's always hope for a beautiful new beginning. With all my love and warmest wishes for your happiness and healing, this is Rose, reminding you that sometimes our greatest blessings come disguised as our most difficult challenges.